microphone ready to go?
We're recording.
Mr. Dodson. Cool.
Hi, sir.
Okay, well, we are fortunate to have with us today Professor Bill Jones. Professor Jenny Bill Jones is a legal scholar specializing in Indian law and tribal development. She holds a BA and MA degree in rural development and an AAS in paralegal studies from UAF. She taught courses in federal Indian law, ANCSTA, international indigenous issues, and native land rights and economic development. She retired from full-time position with the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development in 2016. Prior to entering academia, Jenny held a 25-year career in heavy industry, working as a welder inspector, mechanical inspector, and at multiple locations throughout the U.S. She is a Jenny, help me out. Métis, thank you. With a large extended Indian family and has lived and worked for years in Indian country. She has a couple of associates accompanying her today, which I'm going to leave it to Jenny to deal with.
I will let Dr. Carroll do that part.
Okay. So hi, I'm Dr. Jenny Carroll, born Jenny Linkus. So my dad's back there. And so just because some people will know, you know, my maternal grandparents started Fairbanks Fast Photo. My parents took it over, and I grew up here, working in the store, graduated from Lathrop. As it says, I have a BA from Harvard, a PhD, master's and PhD from UAF, and have worked since 1999 for the college, or for the university, starting with the community colleges and now with this department. And my husband is Wachagwachin from Fort Yukon. And then do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure.
Or you want me to?
You can do it. All right. It'd be nice, but my name is Pat Sikiakwapdiwa. I'm a Hopi from Arizona. You can call me Pat. I don't want to torment anybody with my last name. Pat is fine. I got my BA at Stanford University in California and my JD at UC Berkeley. I grew up in Arizona, but I went away to college in California. And presently, I teach in the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, more on the rural development side. A lot of our students are native from rural Alaska, and they're coming from both tribal and ANC and nonprofit backgrounds. I also serve as a justice on the Hopi Tribe's appellate court, the High Court. And so some of my experience here, I guess today, is coming from a large Indian reservation, a classic traditional Indian reservation that was set up in the 1800s that operates much like a state government. And so I guess I'm here for contrast. So thank you for having us.
So Jenny, the floor is yours.
Where is yours?
Well, let's go ahead.
Okay, it's not doing what I'm telling it to do.
So that we don't blame Jumbo for that.
I will just use this. All right.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for letting me come here today, letting us come. Our goal is to provide some information about Indian country and tribes and try to counter what we have seen going on, which seems to be a lot of fear about Indian country coming to Alaska. And it's fear that we feel is probably unfounded. And we tend to look at the existence of tribes in Alaska as an opportunity rather than something to be afraid of. And today we'd like to provide a little information about what Indian country is and how the business community might interact. So if we could go to the next slide. What is Indian country? Well, we're looking at, where are my notes? another term for Indian trust lands, or that is lands held in trust by the federal government on behalf of Indian tribes and individual Indian owners. Some of these lands are known as reservations, and those, of course, are the lands that tribes reserved for themselves when they ceded land to the United States. And let's go to slide 5. And I should say, we're going to go through this PowerPoint quickly. The PowerPoint is available to you. You can take it home with you. You can ask questions about it. I will answer any questions that you send me. People who know me know that I will answer those questions in detail. So, yes, lots of detail. So save the questions if you will. We don't currently have very much legal Indian country in Alaska. Metlakatla Indian Reserve was established by Act of Congress in 1891. We have some small parcels held in trust for Cake, Klawak, Angoon, Heidelberg, and Craig, and those, of course, are all in southeast Alaska. We have Indian allotments that were attained under the Alaska Native Allotment Act, and we have town site lots acquired under the Alaska Native Town Site Act, and we have some easements and rights of way. And these lands are Indian country according to the legal description in the United States Code. So this is not something that was made up. This is actually in federal law. There are currently some small parcels of fee land in Juneau, Ninilchik, and Fort Yukon that are undergoing the request to be placed into trust. We don't know where those are at the moment. We don't know whether they will be approved. If it's a town site lot or an allotment, it is held in trust for individual Alaska natives, not for tribes. So an allotment isn't tribal property. That belongs to an individual Alaska native, different from Indian country that a tribe has jurisdiction over. Could we go to the next slide? Fee versus trust. Well, why is that important? We hear a lot of talk about fee lands. If you own fee lands, you are a private landowner. That would be anybody who owns private land in the state, including the ANCSA corporations. You can do a lot of things with those fee lands. You have responsibilities that go along with them. But the one thing that you cannot do is you cannot create your own laws and regulations. So if you own fee lands, you've got a lot of rights. There's a lot of things you can do with them. But if you are a government and you own fee lands, these may be a liability for you. Let's go to the next slide. Why would somebody want to place land into trust? If you've got fee land, and that gives you the highest form of ownership in this country, why would you want to do that? Well, there's a number of reasons, and I'm not going to go into these different types of trusts, but there are several within Alaska, including a mechanism for ANCSA corporations, should they choose to place land into a settlement trust. None of these mechanisms provide governing powers. So if you are a farmer and you place your land into a farmland trust, you are providing some protection for that land for future generations, but that doesn't mean that you are regulating the land. If you wish to protect land for conservation reasons, you can do so. If you want to take your ANCSA lands and provide them with protections that, for instance, might outlive the land bank, you can do that. But none of these things give you governing powers. Let's go to that next slide. Where does this governing power come from? Well, we need to look back in our legal system and at our history, and we find that the United States recognizes that Alaska Natives and American Indians have legal rights to lands and resources that predated European contact. And you'll see on this slide, there are 3 different kinds of tribally owned lands. And in Alaska, the one we're really interested in, of course, is the fee land, unrestricted fee land, because that's what tribes have today. ANCSA lands are not tribally owned lands. Their shareholders may or may not be tribal citizens, but the lands themselves are not owned by tribes. These are lands that are fee lands owned by the ANCSA corporations, and they are subject to the laws of the state of Alaska. ANCSA corporations cannot make law regarding their own land. They do need to abide by Alaska state law. They're not Indian country. There was a court case made its way through all the way to the Supreme Court in 1998 that held that ANCSA lands are not Indian country because there is no federal superintendence over those lands. An ANCSA corporation doesn't have to go to the federal government and get permission to do something. That's their land. They do what they like with it as long as they do not break any federal and state laws. Next slide. Why do the Alaska tribes want to place the fee lands that they own into trust? Why do they want to take a federal trustee? Why, if they've got fee land, they've got that highest form of ownership, why would they want to make this change? Well, we need to look at a tribe as a government. It's the government of a tribal community, and that community views their lands as homelands. They want to preserve these lands intact for future generations, just as a state or a nation wishes to do. There are benefits of trust land for tribes: protection from loss, ability to raise revenue, same way as governments do in other places, regulatory powers, and protection of tribal members' assets. That's very important, especially in Alaska, where tribes are small and they tend to not have very much in the way of assets. If those lands are not protected by the tribe, that is a breach of their responsibility to their citizens. They need to protect the assets that they have. This is not a choice. It's not something to just put out there and risk. They do have a responsibility. They can enact laws and regulations, and these may be very similar to what you see in any other jurisdiction. So when we see a fear, some kind of fear of, well, if a tribe enacts rules and regulations, I won't be able to understand that. Well, I have read tribal codes from all over this country, and I have yet to find one that I could not understand. And if I can understand them, so can other people. Let's go to that next slide.
If we could, just back on this last slide.
Yes.
It almost sounds like really what we're talking about to a degree is protection against individual members
of the tribe itself. Again, you're essentially, by putting into trust, you make a mandate for collective action vis-a-vis land. Is that correct?
In some cases, yes, that could be correct. If a tribe has some type of corruption going on, which tribes are as susceptible to this as any other government. We see corruption going on all over this country at the moment. Let's say you have a tribe where somebody decides to sell some of the assets without asking the rest of the tribe. Having that land in trust for the tribe protects it from something like that happening. So it not only protects it from external problems, it also protects it from the possibility of internal. So you're correct. It's protecting it on every level. Next slide. How does that land become trust land? Well, first of all, again, if the tribe doesn't own that fee land, it can't take it into trust. It can't take somebody else's land into trust. It's got to own that land. It may have acquired it from a village corporation. There have been some acts of village corporations that have conveyed small amounts of lands to tribes. It could be a transfer from a city government. It could be an Alaska Native town site land where a city did not form. The tribe may have purchased land, or somebody may have gifted the land to them. And I want to point out that not every property that a tribe owns in fee may be appropriate for placing into trust. This is something that a tribe needs to consider for itself. They're really going to have to look at the pros and cons before they go and say, oh, we want to place our land into trust. What do they want to do with it in the future? So individual tribes, that's a decision for them to make. We don't have any current precedent for very large amounts of land being taken into trust in modern times. So we don't know what would happen, say, a tribe with a large amount of land were to petition. We do know that DOI, Department of Interior, considers these petitions on a case-by-case basis. And we also know that when they are considering them, they are considering their ability to administer the trust. So they may decide that they cannot be responsible for a certain amount of land or a certain location. So do we know what would happen if a tribal landowner that has, say, 1 million acres of land were to petition all of that to place it in trust? We have no idea. I'd have no way to tell you whether there's a likelihood of that being approved. Next slide. Where would they be? Well, the goal of the process is to benefit the tribal community. So if DOI is going to approve the transfer of lands into trust, it's most likely to be somewhere where the tribe will benefit. So somewhere close to the tribe's homelands. They're not going to approve a request for land that is hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the tribe. That's very unlikely to happen. The current fee lands held by tribes are mostly small parcels. They're primarily in rural areas. There are 5 tribes with large parcels that you can see on the slide, and all of those are in very rural locations. There are currently no laws or court decisions that require an ANCSA corporation to convey land to a tribe. So before we conflate tribes and corporations, remember that those 44 million acres that the ANCSA corporations own are not going to become subject to lands into trust petitions unless an ANC decides to convey some of that land to a tribe. Nobody is telling them that they must go out there and do that. Next slide. Advantages and disadvantages. I think I will let Dr. Carroll quickly walk through these.
Okay.
Give my voice a break for a second.
All right.
That
Sure.
ALS coming again.
So as you can see, we have very small amounts of both tribal fee land and tribal trust land in Alaska. So most of the land is you know, that is involved with Alaska Native settlements is ANCSA land. So very small. Your fee land is subject to taxation if it lies within a taxing area. Your trust land is not, but it is likely to be taxed perhaps by the tribe because that's part of why a tribe would want trust land. Fee land is subject to liens and attachments, so that's kind of, you know, you can put it up for collateral, or you can have liens placed against it. Trust lands are protected in that way. Fee lands, a tribe can sell any fee land they want. Again, trust lands, it would have to be removed from the trust in order to be sold. Something very important, tribes have no jurisdiction or law enforcement powers over their fee lands, whereas over trust lands, they can make and enforce laws. Now, there's a lot of complications to that, a lot of ways in which they're restricted and what kinds of laws they can make and whatnot, but there are some core things that they can do to work on to improve public safety if they have trust lands. Trust lands are a little more, if you're going to develop your trust lands, I mean, in a fee land, a tribe probably should be developing it for the benefit of their citizens, right? But in trust lands, it's absolutely kind of mandatory. Trust lands have BIA oversight. That may not be considered a positive, but that's part of the deal with trust lands. Trust lands have eligibility for more federal funding, so it's another possibility of bringing some sort of support into the state, and with fee lands, much more limited. Again, land could be used collateral for loans if it's fee land, not if it's trust. And under both, you can lease the land, but under the tribal trust lands, your trustee, again, the federal government, would be involved in that and monitoring that. And like Jenny said, this isn't like a one or the other slam dunk decision. Every tribe, it has to look at what they have, where it is, what they want to do, and does this make sense? Because, you know, it's a big process and it's a change.
Can I add a caveat on that? So on the tribal fee land, when a tribe owns private property, a tribe may still have jurisdiction over its tribal members who are on that private property. So that's like a subtle distinction here, but it's not territorial jurisdiction over the property.
Mm-hmm.
Can you dive into that just a little bit?
So there was a there was an Alaska Supreme Court case called John v. Baker, and it involved children's matters. And in that case, the Alaska Supreme Court lined up with federal Indian law and said that tribes have inherent jurisdiction over their members. It's an internal domestic matter, and it's part of their inherent sovereignty that carries forward. And so the Alaska Supreme Court recognized that tribes can and do exercise jurisdiction in tribal court over their members. And they may be living on a piece of private property, is what I'm getting at.
I guess I may be a little behind the 8 ball.
Yeah.
Shush, Jim. These things have always been so blended in my discussions for so long, that the distinction between a tribe, a corporation, a village, and a corporation, what tribes do we have? What federally, don't we have like over 200 federally recognized
do.
tribes here in Alaska?
209.
229.
229?
Yeah, you do. You have
129, and sometimes it looks like 230, but
depends on how you
not quite
count them
sure
on the
who the
list.
30th.
Yeah, and tribes are not ANCSA corporations. That's like the thing we have to keep saying over and over again. They're actually different stakeholder groups that overlap a bit. But the decision-making power, one's a corporation, one's a government.
Weren't tribes statutorily created by the federal government in the state of Alaska?
No. Under current federal Indian law and under Alaska Supreme Court precedent as of now, they recognize the inherent pre-existing sovereign status of tribes in Alaska.
I thought Ada Deer introduced to Ted the creation of the number of tribes that have been elicited here.
So that list recognizes the specific tribal federally recognized entities. And the BIA, I mean, unless you go through the whole federal acknowledgement process, that's a recognition of a sovereign that was already there. So it's merely a listing of the recognized tribes, the official list, but it's not a creation of a tribal sovereign from scratch.
To your knowledge, didn't the ANCSA settle I guess the ANCSA settlement, the $900 million, and didn't that extinguish those sovereign rights?
No, it was a land settlement, not a sovereignty settlement. So it didn't affect the sovereign status of the tribes. It affected the property ownership of those tribes. You have to split out the sort of government piece of it from the property holding piece of it. And I know that's hard. It's hard to think about a government that doesn't have territory, but that's what ANCSA did. It split those two things apart. And now tribes are trying to take land back into trust to have some more territorial jurisdiction and regulatory jurisdiction and property also. But I know Jenny wanted to get through her slide set, so keep your next question and ask it at the end of the slide set.
And I also, by the way, could answer that question in greater detail in writing and give you the whole historical piece there if you want it. But that would take us way past 11 o'clock. Let's go to our next slide. And I'll let Jenny do this one again.
Sure. This slide is just to show you what you would need, what a tribe needs in order to qualify for putting lands into trust. So obviously legal description, clear proof of ownership. They need to have one of the following needs identified: economic development, tribal self-determination, or non-commercial Indian housing. What purpose they would be using the property, documentation of compliance. What does NEPA stand for?
National Environmental Policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Which, by the way, is an expensive and complicated process going through that compliance if you have any amount of land at all. Maybe not so much if you just want half an acre, but if you want to get a NEPA compliance on a few hundred acres, that's going to cost you some.
Yeah. And I think one of the important things that we wanted to show in this slide is that it isn't enough to say, oh, we have this piece of property and we don't want to pay property tax on it anymore, so let's put it into trust. That's not grounds for putting something into trust.
You're not going to get you will not get a petition approved
Purely on that basis.
purely on that.
Yeah, let's take downtown Los Angeles into trust. That would remove a lot of tax base for LA. Not happening.
Let's go to our next slide. Okay, well, I'll see if my voice will come back here. Let's talk about the sovereignty issue. Tribes are sovereign, whether or not they have Indian country. So now we're going to complicate things because we're looking at tribal sovereignty as something that we've already got. So even if we don't get any more Indian country in Alaska, we do have tribal sovereignty. And when we're talking about sovereignty in business terms, one of the things we are concerned about is tribal sovereign immunity. And a tribe is immune from suit unless it has expressly waived immunity or Congress has unequivocally abrogated it. Never been able to say that word properly, but I tried. You can't get around sovereign immunity by trying to do clever things. You can't say, okay, well, I'm going to bring a suit against the property rather than the person. Or, well, it's not really the tribe, it's somebody else. They've got the sovereign immunity, and unless they have waived it, this keeps them safe from a suit. There are a lot of laws, a lot of lawsuits that we can look at where deals have gone wrong in Indian country. I want to point out that for every one of those, there are many, many more where deals have gone wrong that have absolutely nothing to do with Indian tribes or Indian country. In this country, when we have a problem with a contract, we go to court. That's where we go to resolve our issues. So if an Indian tribe has to take, or somebody working with an Indian tribe has to go to court, this should not be a surprise. That is what we do if we want to resolve a contract that's gone south. So before we go, oh my goodness, look at all those lawsuits, remember, that's just a drop in the bucket compared to all those other lawsuits out there involving business deals that somebody's got a problem with. They're just using the same system as everybody else uses to sort out that problem. One thing that you would want to discuss if you are negotiating a waiver of sovereign immunity is, where would you take the case? Are you going to be in state court? Are you going to be in tribal court? How are you going to resolve this? So this is something that part of your discussion, if you are entering into some business arrangement with a tribe, should involve. How are we going to resolve disputes? And that, by the way, I hope would be something that people entering into business do anyway, no matter who it is. I hope that, you don't just go in there and not even consider these things. Obtaining a waiver shouldn't be a barrier to doing business, but I do recommend you get legal advice from somebody who understands what the ins and outs are, because there are some. Let's go to that next slide. Why is this so important for a tribe? Well, remember that they are governments. They are investing in business to raise revenue to pay for services. And they're using public assets. So they really need to protect those assets. If they get involved in some type of a lawsuit, they could lose their entire core assets. And keep in mind that tribes, especially in Alaska, most of them are pretty small. The tribal budget is not going to be very large. Lawsuits are extremely expensive. Just the cost of a lawsuit alone could wipe out a tribe. So this is one of the reasons it's so important that they have that sovereign immunity. It is in place to protect them. It isn't in place to allow them to just arbitrarily renege on a contract. Now, that's not the reason for it. It is in place to protect their core tribal assets. So when you use it properly, it protects all parties, not just the tribe. It protects anybody who is a party to that contract. And we really want to make sure that we do this. Let's go to that next slide. When do you need a waiver? Well, with a tribe, yes. With a tribally owned business, yes, unless they've got something in place where they are already waiving their immunity for all purposes of doing business. And if they do, I suggest you read that very carefully. Read the fine print, always. A tribal employee, maybe. This depends on what you're doing. A tribal employee may be subject to suit if they act in violation of federal law. So that's a gray area, and you might or might not want your waiver there.
And that usually sits in tribal law, those
Yeah.
waivers.
Yeah. ANCSA regional corporations, no. These are not sovereign entities or tribally owned businesses. Same thing with the ANCSA Village Corporation. Again, they are not sovereign entities or tribally owned businesses. No need for a waiver of sovereign immunity if you are doing business with those guys. And no need if you are doing some type of business with a tribal citizen. So maybe, let's say, a bed and breakfast in a village, and you want to contract with the bed and breakfast owner to transport tourists up and down the river to spend the weekend at the bed and breakfast. You don't need a waiver of sovereign immunity to do that contract. What you should do, though, is if the business were in Indian country, which of course in Alaska it's probably not going to be, if it were, you would want to find out what kind of regulations were involved within that Indian country. We don't know what they would be, but you would want to find out. Again, remember that these waivers protect everybody and not just the tribe. These are there to protect all parties. Next slide. A little bit more on the waivers. Know who you're doing business with. That's really important. Is it somebody who has authority? Are they authorized by the tribe to sign contracts? Is it a tribally owned business? Is it an arm of the tribe? Who is it? Who are you doing business with? If you're not sure, take a look at their governing documents. Examine how they approach doing business. I highly recommend looking at Tlingit and Haida Central Council's Civil Code, because they have spelled out their conditions for the business arm of the tribe. And that's a good example of a tribe that has said, you know, we're going to be doing business and we want it to be very clear what our position is. Fort Yukon also has civil code, and you'll see that the approaches to sovereign immunity are very different, which is why it's tribe by tribe. You can't say you had this experience with one tribe, so it's going to be exactly the same with another tribe.
And it may be contract by contract too.
And contract by
Yeah.
contract. So this is, it is complex. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, this is very easy to do. You definitely should have legal counsel to help you understand waivers. And that goes for the tribe as well as the outside party. There's a lot of information. We've got some recommendations in the resources. The American Bar Association has a very good recent primer on what this looks like. And the same law applies whether you are doing business with a tribe in Iowa or in Alaska. The law applies to tribes overall. Now, the internal law of the tribe may be different, but as far as how federal law views it, there's no difference for tribes in Alaska versus tribes somewhere else. So what you're really looking at is, does the tribe have an internal law that is different? That's the piece that could complicate your waiver. That's what takes it out of the cookie cutter area. The presence of Indian country may expand business opportunities for a tribe, but it doesn't reduce or increase the need for a waiver. You need that waiver either way, Indian country or no Indian country. And a tribe is going to retain immunity from suit if they have not waived that immunity. So understand that. Don't go in there not thinking that this applies. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to let Professor Carroll go over some of the different types of businesses that take place with Indian tribes in Alaska.
So this gets into sort of my area of what I do at the university or in our department, which is working with students in developing projects. And the projects that my students do are in economic development, but also human development, cultural development, all areas of development they have an interest in, and a lot of times they overlap. And looking particularly in sort of that balance between culture and modern development and what people want to have. It's really tough out there. Development is really tough out there because the locations are remote and small. You know, economies of scale don't apply, right? There's a real lack of capital for them. There's limited infrastructure in terms of, you know, how do you develop? I mean, one of the issues right now that is going on that some of you probably heard about is that the you know, we've, in terms of our ability to get to the villages here in the interior, our options are becoming more limited with the changes in the airlines. And if you can't easily get back and forth to villages, it reduces your economic development opportunities because you need that infrastructure, whatever it is. And also just overall minimal opportunities to develop lands and resources. But these tribal communities all have some, you know, the same needs that anybody else has. You know, they need reliable economical energy, you know, tourism as development. They need food security. Food issues are really, really big. They need quality education. They need their transportation. They need all of these things. And these things provide opportunities for interactions with these larger communities. Again, something that we all experienced just last week, right, with everybody coming in for the TCC conference. I mean, those connections between urban and rural communities are really important and a good place for everybody to build. And we have a lot of, we want to see actually what some lower 48 tribal communities do in terms of business. We have that in the references. So the emphasis on tribal trust lands then in this case is that tribal trust lands would allow the tribal government itself to do the work and gain the revenue and then do the work to develop some things like infrastructure that could then support tribal economies. This is just these are some examples. Some of these are, the ones on the right are things that my students have done or explored over the last 4 years. And I just picked out the economic development ones. I didn't include the human development projects, for example, that students have come up with. There's a lot of interest with our students, and many of our students are tribal citizens, and of course corporate shareholders as well often. And there's a lot of interest. People want to strengthen their communities in this way. But again, it's difficult, and a lot of times what we're finding is that they're not, you know, some of their ideas aren't going to be workable given the situation. For example, one of my favorite projects from last year was the exploration of waste to energy development in Nome. Nome does not produce enough waste to economically do a waste energy. So unless we come up with some new technology, even Nome, which is one of our larger rural communities, that's not necessarily something they can do. So a lot of times what students explore isn't going to work out. Some things though, the B&Bs, at least one of them is already operational. Same thing with the village store, the seaweed farm. The other thing that you find with my students is that the greatest success in terms of a project actually being implemented has to do with whether or not they are connected to another entity. So if they are connected with a nonprofit, if they are connected with their tribe, if they are connected with a corporation, and they are partnering with that organization, then what they do has a much better chance of being implemented because they're doing it with a partner that has sort of that basic support that can help them. So just to keep in mind that really successful work out there requires partnerships. Very few people can kind of go it alone. And what else do I want to tell you about? Because I get very excited about my students. Just that there's a real interest and a real concern and with making sure that people can stay out there, and economic development is a huge part of that. If you cannot stay, I mean, if you can't make a living, if your people can't make a living, they're not likely to stay, and people don't want that. They don't want that at all. Any other thoughts about?
It's really hard to build a new business in rural Alaska. I'm not from here, and I joined the department. Boy, we look at every angle, every possibility, and you know, any opportunity that looks viable, like lands into trust, that's going to serve a lot more people than those who just open the business. It creates economy, I guess is what I'm saying. It builds economy.
It's the lands into trust piece is giving the tribal government another tool to build infrastructure so that these kind of small businesses can actually come into being. Because if you lack the basic infrastructure, you're not going to be able. It's too difficult. It's too difficult for an entrepreneur to say, okay, I'm going to set up a new bed and breakfast. You've got to have some infrastructure there to support that. And that's a piece of the tribes taking their land into trust. That's a tool in their toolbox. It obviously cannot be their only tool, but it is a tool. Next slide. And I'm going to say that I'll let Professor Pat go through that very quickly as we're getting a little short on time.
So did you want to reserve any time for questions?
Sure. I think that would be great. I suspect there will be questions. So, yeah, however you want to deal with this, but this is up to it.
Well, we could skip that slide entirely if we want.
And by the way, we do go past 9 if you want to. So.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, I can tell you one thing about this slide, which is that tribes have their own written laws, and in the lower 48, they're very well developed, and up here, tribes are still building this out. Less so, Southeast has much more developed tribal law in the tribes there. When you come up this way, it's really undeveloped, and they're still building it out.
Good. What about gaming? I'll run through this one really quickly and tell you that Alaska law prohibits Class 3 gaming. So we're not going to have a casino on every corner or even on any corner unless the state changes its law. So those who are concerned about there being lots of casinos, that's not going to happen anytime soon. A tribe might conduct Class 2 gaming on trust lands, but only if they comply with state laws and regulations regarding these games. And they're going to have to show the Indian Gaming Commission that they have jurisdiction and can actually exercise governmental powers over the gaming site. So, and having looked at the requirements for that, it's quite extensive. You don't just get to call them up and say, I think I want to open a bingo hall. Well, they're going to ask for a whole lot more than that. And if they were to get a license for Class 2 gaming, whoever gets that license, and it has to be an Indian tribe, has to qualify for it under state law. So you're not able to, with gaming, to make up your own qualifications. That falls under federal law. So gaming is very, very strongly restricted, and to be quite honest, I think we're unlikely to see that around here. The tribal fee lands tend to be out in the middle of nowhere, and casinos, any kind of gambling, even a bingo hall, requires customers. Customers need to be able to get to and from the gambling site. If your fee lands are in Chalkitsik, I don't think that investing your tribal dollars in opening a Class 2 gaming operation is going to be a wise use of funds. You're not going to be able to sustain it. So the reality is that I don't think we're going to see any amount of gaming if we do get any more Indian trust land anytime soon. You could have Class 2 gaming, but would you want to? Are you even in a location where that would be viable? Next slide. What about ANCSA? Well, first of all, remember that the ANCSA lands are not going to be subject to being taken into trust unless an ANCSA corporation conveys its land to a tribe. If it does do this, and it conveys all or substantially all of its assets, shareholders need to agree to this. The ANCSA corporation doesn't just get to say, oh, we're transferring our land over to the tribe, and that's a done deal. That's going to involve shareholders. If the shareholders dissent, the shareholders will need to be bought out. So there's a lot to consider for a village corporation before it would transfer its lands. It would be highly unlikely that a regional corporation would convey any land to a tribe, because a regional corporation has an obligation to shareholders all over the region, not just to the tribe. So I think that I would be very, very surprised. I cannot speak for ANCSA corporations, but it would certainly surprise the heck out of me if a regional corporation were to turn around and convey land to a tribe. I can't imagine them doing that. As far as 7I and 7J revenue sharing is concerned, that continues as long as an ANCSA corporation is still doing business and developing subsurface resources. So that does not go away. There have been a lot of questions about how that would work. And for those of you who are interested, I can send you the document that we have here at the bottom, which shows how DOI answered specific questions about how ANCSA lands would be involved. There are ways for the dually owned lands to be addressed. So transferring surface land to a tribe and then placing it into trust does not preclude development of the subsurface rights. Something to keep in mind is that nothing in ANCSA dictates what happens to land after it is conveyed to another party. If you and I own fee land and we sell it to somebody, we do not get to dictate what that somebody is going to do with that land. That's the same thing for an ANCSA corporation. Once it has conveyed the land to another party, it's up to that party what they get to do with that land. Next slide. Are these going to be bad for non-tribal citizens in Alaska? Well, I'm guessing maybe we have some questions about that. So I'm going to let you take a look at that slide for a minute. I personally don't think that trust lands are going to have negative effects on non-tribal citizens in Alaska. I will say that. And I think that if we can do things that will improve the quality of life in tribal communities, that benefits all of us. When we're looking at whether trust lands are going to be bad for non-tribal citizens, I think we might want to ask ourselves, what kind of a community do we want next door to us? Do we want a healthy, vibrant community with a decent economy and people with jobs, stable, a place where somebody can go and start a small business and be successful, a place with good law enforcement and public safety? Or do we want the opposite of that? And I think that probably all of us would go with description A. And if trust lands can help that, if they can be a tool to help get to description A, then I think they benefit everybody. Next slide. There's our conclusion. Small businesses, very important to a healthy community. You know they're important in Fairbanks. Where would we be if we didn't have our small businesses? Same thing applies in a tribal community. Tribal citizens want the same kind of things. They really don't want something very different. And they would like a structure where they can do that. So can we reduce dependency on state and federal funding? Well, we can certainly try. And tribes that can raise revenue on their own are going to be able to reduce their dependency. And that, I think, would be beneficial to everybody in this state. And saying that, I'm going to stop and let you pepper us with questions.
Okay, questions? It's not a question exactly, it's a statement, and it has to do with my experience, lots of experience in life, experience in economic development, and I guess first of all, and this doesn't my opinion on this particular end of it is not substantial enough for anybody to need to answer this, but as I have viewed reservations in the United States and seen how it has economically impacted Native Americans, I'm not proud of it. While I understand that those of you that are trying to promote economic development would almost grasp at any tool, because we almost have to too, it's difficult. I'm not sure that this is going to be an adequate tool to move the gauntlet in the direction that you would like to move it. But what Jenny just said about what type of community would we rather live next to, I agree with you 100% that we should all strive to make our communities, collective communities in Alaska, economically successful. I'm just not convinced that trust land is a viable tool for that. So there's no need to comment.
I would like to just have a response to that. So when they were drafting ANCSA up here, they sold the Pueblos to the Alaska Natives as a bad example on the Indian reservation. And I grew up in a Pueblo. And so the thing I would say about trust land is that the goal from a tribal perspective is not just economic development. That's a side goal, actually. The primary goal is preservation of the communal land holdings, because the traditional lifeways depend upon communal land holdings and conservation to a large extent. So there is admittedly a higher goal of communal land holding and conservation, maintaining clan lands at Hopi, because from the lands you derive the goods for the ceremonies and the ceremonial cycles in the village. All of that would fall apart if you turned everything into private property and let people go hog wild in a free market. There would be no more Hopi culture. It would dissipate pretty quickly. The language would die pretty quickly. So I admit that there is a dual goal with trust lands. And some tribes in Alaska are very much like the Hopis and would like to see that kind of protected preservation of their homeland for their traditional system and lifeways. Some tribes are very modern here, and they do want to have much more of a free market kind of experience and goals. And economic development is their #1 goal. So I would say that we really have to look at this region by region, tribe by tribe.
And again, we're not saying that this is the solution, but that it is one potential tool for those tribes who have this interest and need. And that's why they, you know, nobody should be going out willy-nilly and doing this. They've got to really think, what is our goal?
Sure.
You know, what do we want to do?
Yes.
Yes, hi, I'm Jennifer Fate. I'm on Joy Unlimited Board, and I've been on it for 13 years. And so I've been very aware of this lands into trust, and actually worked with some of the authors of the original Indian Laws and Order Review Commission report dated November 2013 down in Los Angeles. And so I've been following this very closely. Doyon has a position paper that they sent into the Secretary of Interior on this issue. If you want to read that paper, you should definitely contact Doyon. I'm here in an unofficial capacity, but I've followed this very closely, and I've actually read the recent Attorney General's letter to the Secretary of Interior, which takes a different position than Doyon. A stronger position. I'm sure you have read that as well. Doyon is not opposed in concept to lands into trust, especially with regard to non-ANCSA lands and townships. There's a huge need in rural Alaska for the opportunity to get federal funding in certain situations. It's an additional resource to bring into communities. Not one government entity, whether it's the state or the federal government, can provide everything for any given community. So the more opportunities that exist for funding from different areas, we think the better. I think our issue has always been with regard to transfers of surface land to the tribe without the consent of the regional corporation vis-a-vis the subsurface interest. And so we would never want to see a unilateral transfer. If it involved regional corporation subsurface land, we would want to have the opportunity, we would want the right as subsurface owners to approve that naturally, because these involve our land selections that were made for development. So that's basically, you know, it's much more of a supportive approach to the tribes vis-a-vis their opportunities, with the caveat that any interest of subsurface would require our regional corporation approval. But to get a full idea of Doyon's position, I would say contact Doyon and read their letter, and it's a really really well written, thought out, holistic look at the needs, the local needs vis-a-vis our interests as a regional. And you brought that up,
Yep.
Jenny,
Yeah.
already. Thank you.
Pride of. One of the larger questions has always been and will continue to be economic development. Regardless of putting land in trust, regardless of whether it's a village corporation, the final question is always, what is the economy of the village? And you've stated that the trust can be an infrastructure towards that economic development. Jim has basically said that, well, maybe, maybe not. So really the larger question is it possible, after having failed, whether you have trust land or not trust land, and it probably will fail economically, is it possible to reverse the dials on the clock and opt out of that land trust situation and go back to a more fee simple, where basically a free market society has always been more of an inducement towards economic development than the federal government allows. That's been proven on reservations in the lower 48 time after time after time. The basic question then would be, is there a protocol by which you could opt out of of that land trust.
So your question is, supposing the tribe takes land into trust and say finds out 10, 20 years later that it's not working.
Or 10, 5, whatever.
Or 5, however long
whatever
it
the
takes.
time.
Yeah. Can they reverse that? That's a good question.
That's termination,
Yeah,
right?
that would
So-
be, that would be.
Well, leave it to me and you'll get some.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's okay. That's a very good question.
Yeah, you could, it would require the approval of the United States government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the question would be, who is asking for it? Who, you know, one person, a majority vote of the tribal members, the tribal council? I mean, that's the question.
I'd like to just bring up that although we've really focused on the kinds of economic development that is more familiar, you know, in modern society, subsistence is an economy, and it is a functional economy. And so protecting or establishing some sort of support for a subsistence portion of your economy that goes for subsistence is successful economic development. And again, in some regions, if trust land, and I realize we're not talking about trust land where they put, you know, acreages into trust where you can hunt or whatever, but there are other types of economic development that trust land could support besides the kinds of selling and et cetera, that really does, I mean, require much better infrastructure so that you can get goods to market, for example, and stuff like that, which right now we don't have a lot of.
I wonder too, if rural Alaska isn't so heavily subsidized anyway by the federal government that a market economy is not possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wonder if that underlying assumption is a flawed one. And I'm asking.
Well, if I may, I think it is. You don't know that many years ago now, I was in the state legislature. Reggie Jewell from Kotzebue, many people know him, very close friend of mine, Eskimo, used to get together and go over that very question and came up with out-of-the-box thinking, such as Reggie said. In the fly tying industry, white hairs are at a premium. They have to bleach them. Let's go polar bear hunting. It would create a business all its own because you have to go through all the hairs to define which is the fine hairs and the coarse hairs. You have to clean them. You have to package them. You have to export them. It would be a worldwide, and it's good thinking. I thought of a wildfowl safari in the deltas of the Kuskokwim and the Yukon River, where it's just nothing but lakes and flatland. But there's tens of thousands of flocks of ducks and geese that you can hunt, for example, in season. The lower 48 people would go wild for a hunting safari on things such as, you can think out of the box into a market economy. So I don't adhere to the concept that we have to keep the people afloat. It just takes leadership, it takes seed money, it takes out of the box thinking, it takes some help. But you have to think economic development. You can't just keep thinking, oh, we'll just go along with let the federal government or the state government or whatever government keep patting the bell for us.
I think the argument on the tribe side is that even to have economic development, you need some government. You need some infrastructure. You need a funneling of resources to build roads, to build office buildings, to build homes for your employees. I mean, completely free. There needs to be some economic development in a place where there's no infrastructure. I'm sorry, there needs to be some government and some funding of that government structure. And right now, a lot of that in rural Alaska is coming from the federal government, I'm guessing.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
So,
Hold on.
You're right.
would you mind taking that message to the governor that in order there to be economic activity, there needs to be some government. So, really important.
We're having the same conversation at the university.
Incidentally, I was a regent for 16 years up there. And
Ah.
my wife, Mary Jane, was a regent for 8.
Wow.
Okay, well, let me get Roger first.
Okay.
He's been
Well, I
waving his arm here.
really appreciate you folks coming here today, and I think you really have a very good presentation. Gives us a little better understanding of what, we're dealing with, and, my wife was quite involved with EBSCA, and, took about 10 years of battling, to try to get it finally passed, and, there is the native or rural people have benefited, from it, from EBSCA, and, I know the trust issue has been brought up, and, there may be some instances where it can, work to the benefit of the locals, but, what Bud brought up is the fact that, there needs to be, in order to have business or develop, you have to have infrastructure, and you have to be able to show where you're gonna be able to economically make it, whether it's government money that, of course, government money is helping to support a lot of the villages, and, it's been a tough go, and, but EBSCA, I think, has helped those villages survive, and right now, villages are in jeopardy. A lot of people are moving out of the villages in Anchorage, into Fairbanks, and, because there's no opportunity in those regions, but, there are many people in the villages that hold dear to what life has to offer there. So, thank you very much. I hope we'll be able to get a copy of this presentation.
We'll make sure you do, Roger.
Thank you.
Let's get PJ.
Yes, Jim. Well, I've got a couple of questions. Thank you, Professor Jones, and thank you, ladies, for all that you do. And, well, growing up, I'm a plumber by trade, but I got into guiding. I was on tribal land and Doyon lands. I'm a Doyon shareholder. I happen to be on the board of directors. I can't speak for a corporation, but I can say, well, here was a situation a few years ago when the Canooty Refuge manager called me up and says, PJ, you can't drive your Argo on the Canooty Refuge. And we have Doyon Inn holdings in there. So I said, okay, I'm not going to drive in the refuge. I'm going to drive on Doyon lands. I'm a shareholder along with 20,000 other shareholders. So I drove in, he circled over me and landed, and supposedly inside the refuge. So I said, I'm not in the refuge, I'm on Indian land. And by law, in the Code of Federal Regulations, he couldn't ask for me for my license or anything because it's written in CFR. So I said, hi, Mike. Hi, PJ. You got 2 moose down? Yes, there's 2 hunters here. Can I help you? And he says, well, you're in your Argo on Indian land. I said, that's pretty obvious. Thank you for landing and talking to me. And so we left, and I delved more into, 1980, all the refuges, Gates of the Arctic. Doyon's got in holdings there, Canooty Refuge. Doyon's got in holdings there, BLM land. We're surrounded by federal lands, and yet we need access to Doyon. And part of that goes into sturgeon case. I was guiding this fall, and the refuge manager says, you can't drive through the refuge of the controlled use area. I'm like, you're kidding me. And it turns out I can drive to Doyon Inn holdings inside a refuge. But the other question is, interestingly enough, in some eyes of the government, ANCs are tribes through, I'll take for example, just because I know, Doyon, we receive housing and urban development money, much like Siri owns half of South Central because there was no tribes in England. So up here in Doyon, with all the native, Fairbanks-based shareholders, we get a lot of money for the at-large people through the Self-Determination Act, and ANCSA decided in '87 by Cena versus Siri. It says in some venues of high standards American English, ANCs are a tribe. So that was my 2 comments on, this cleared a lot of, it got my thinking a lot clearer, because obviously I'm a plumber, I'm not a professor. Thank you, Mr. Don.
You are a professor.
Professor PJ did, this is, you know, so to me, all my life, I've kind of believed that the best government begins inside of your home, and it flows out from there, and by the time you get to the federal government, it's pretty bad. So it kind of always led me to believe, why would I want BLM to be in charge of anything I have to do with? You didn't seem to have very good luck with those guys flying over your head.
No, Mr. Dodson, I did not. You know, one of the things that we're trying to work is build some shareholder guides to create tourism, learn Mandarin, to create tourism in the economy. And here we have some of the federal entities kind of pushing back on us, or also gold mining, small-scale gold mining. Take, for example, Hog River Gold Mine, Taiga Mining. Doyon Canada Chiefs, through Indian Child Protection Act, Indian Child Welfare Act, they could not hire some people from Malakakit because they were felons, Mr. Dodson, a long time ago. They cleaned up their act. And so they've always gone to work at Hog River Gold Mine, you know, starting out 18, 20 bucks an hour, 7, 12, making a good living. And that got closed somehow. They came to Doyon this summer, and we looked at it. It's like, well, you know, the owner said, we need help. So I flew out there along with Emil Nadi and said, what's the big issue? Here's a mine hiring people with a background where nobody else they get hired. So there's some wins, there's some, you know, there's some misunderstanding, and there's a lot of opportunity for everybody. So
Everybody. Okay. Other questions?
Did you want to address?
No, I was just saying that, Professor Johnson, she thinks she wanted to respond.
I was going to address the issue of ANCSA corporations being recognized the same as tribes. For some purposes, there is consultation with ANCSA corporations because of them being the landowners. But that doesn't translate into ANCSA corporations having governing powers of tribes. And I don't think an ANCSA corporation would want those governing powers. I don't know of any good reason why a corporation would also want to take on governing responsibilities. That would seem to me to be something that doesn't match up with the corporate job of making money, which is what corporations do. And Doyon does it very well. I mean, they've done a really stellar, I think, excellent job of building their development, building their portfolio. They're not designed to be governments. They don't have government duties. Governments are there to provide the infrastructure for business to succeed. I don't think Doyon or any other regional corporation would want to try to do both.
But they do, I mean, I think one of the things you're talking about is how corporations address their social responsibility to both their shareholders and, broadly speaking, you know, the people, their descendants, and the people of their region. ANCSA corporations have this social responsibility, and that they are working toward,
Right.
which is which, you know, is a part of the mix, right?
But they couldn't
What we
take
need.
lands into trust, for example.
Well,
Well, one thing you have presently, you have your regional corporations, you have town and the chiefs, and they take care of a lot of the health and welfare, and so I think, you know, at times they've been at odds a little bit, but you know, going back in history, when land claims first came up, you know, the people of the lower 48 or government did not want reservations. And it was finally brought up that maybe the corporate entity would work out to better benefit of the native people up here. And I think it has. You know, there are some people that question certain parts of it, but I think the corporate move was the way to move as far as the profit-making arm. So I don't know. It's been interesting to follow, you know, what's the beginning to what we have today, and you know, hopefully, you know, we can all work together to make it work for Alaska and for the indigenous people up here.
Okay, well, Professor, Jenny, thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing these young ladies. This is a very, very interesting, Roger said, a very interesting presentation. I think we all did learn a lot. Appreciate you leaving this with us, and we will distribute it.
Yep.
And
Very, very much.
I welcome questions, email questions. I promise you that I will respond them
Mm-hmm.
in much greater depth than I was able to respond to oral questions, given that my voice doesn't work very well anymore. So
We could hear you loud and clear.
Right.
I'm glad you could, because I was a little worried about
All
that.
through.
Did you think Jennifer is your
Good
daughter?
job.
Yeah. I'm just trying to like put the puzzle pieces together here.
oh, you want the?
No, actually, no, you did well. So this is a bibliography, huh?
Yeah. We have additional resources
Yeah,
for.
just in case you want to read 1,000.
Right.
Yeah.
So you guys can.
Yeah, in case you have nothing better to do.
Yeah, there's two and a half pages of references.
Okay, actually, may I borrow the mouse for a second?
You.
Again, we're still recording,
Okay.
so this a little lag allows people to, if they
Oh,
can
okay.
pause the video.
Okay, see, did you work with Chair
Yeah, if they
Gardner and
wanna-
Tribal on policy? No, I was working on it.
You guys are both graduates of Stanford, you know that, don't you?
Oh, I understand. Oh, that's great.
Very much, Professor.
You bet.
Thank you very much.
I hope it was helpful.
It was.
Jomo, I may be calling you up for a couple of statistics here.
What, understood, what aspect?
Economic changes I've seen in economic before, now, and after.
Well, I understand,
I'm not sure exactly what you're.
No, my question was.
Oh.
Yeah. I lived in Fort
General or just.
quite a while, so, yeah.
Economics of Fairbanks, understanding state of Alaska.
Whatever you want.
You know, the
It's
laws,
whatever
the
you
rules, the
want.
system.
Hold on one second.
And the movement that it's had in the last 10 years that
How are
really
you, sir?
negatively
job,
impacted
Jenny.
rural Alaska.
Thank you.
So I haven't been following, I
I,
mostly, what I focus
my hearing is
mostly
so
on
bad,
is,
fortunately, I was able to
sort
look
of
at their lips
the
and I could
combination of
figure out what
cultural
you were saying, but there was
opportunity
a
and how
lot
the
that
show
went
is.
over my head.
And then
glad
generally,
you could read my lips and it's still readable.
of,
Oh, they're still reading.
and
Okay.
this is not something that I.
That's good.
Well,
That's
thank you,
fine.
sir.
Political.
You're very knowledgeable and,
How do you upon
Made
your
some
travel,
very good points.
My heart.
whatever the
Thank you.
regular.
Oh, that's a problem.
What I've got to do, a problem.
And so, no, I'm not quite sure
Professor
what
Bell
they've done with it now.
I'm Julia
so-
Nellica,
but
and I'm in the
regulations.
program. I haven't had the opportunity to take it.
Well, thank you. and I'm
My
glad
dad,
you
Ed
came.
Carroll.
I'm really glad about
Sorry, Ed
that.
I
Carroll,
hope
Ed Lincoln.
Got something out of it.
I did, thank you so much.
And Professor Carroll, thank you all of us. Seriously, you don't know what happened.
Thank you so much.
If you have questions,
Of your president.
I will.
I will answer, or at least I'll try.
Thank you.
Bye.
Dan,
Text message.
Huh?
what is that?
So it is?
Kansas winter get too much for you?
Yeah, I'll see you soon, I hope.
What's that? The Kansas winters get too much for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Just time for me to move on.
I didn't know you were back until. Jenny said you were.
Yeah, we, I sold